Greetings, and welcome to another installment of a series of videos that I'm going to give a name to at a later time. I just haven't been able to think of an appropriate name for this series. But this is the first full video in my series that I want to kind of invite you into my own personal study to talk about some of the philosophical concepts related to the abortion issue in a way that's accessible and more informal than I'm used to, especially when I give a presentation in front of an audience. Before I begin, I would like to just point out that I'm drinking a spot of tea from a cup that was given to me, or a glass that was given to me by my good friend Devin Palou when I went to South Carolina to give a couple of presentations to his Ratio Christi groups. So it's a Ratio Christi mug, and it says "No More Blind Faith" in a. Let's see if you can. Sorry, the tea's kind of hot, but it kind of looks like one of those eye charts that you see at the eye doctors. So, yeah, so thanks for that, Devin. And if you're not familiar with Ratio Christi, I would encourage you to become familiar with them. They're a great organization, and they're basically giving apologetics training to Christian college students, and I think that's a great thing. It's definitely something that I support. So, I'd kind of like to kick off this little series by talking about personhood and some about personal identity. Now, the thing is that the concepts of personhood and personal identity, even though they sound similar, they're not the same thing. In that you can be personally identical to yourself, you can be what they might call numerically identical to yourself throughout time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're a person at every point in your life. Some philosophers would argue that personhood is what's called a phase sortal. What that basically just means is that it's something that comes and goes through different phases of your life, kind of like parenthood. How you don't start off as a parent, but it's a phase that you go through. Whenever you conceive a child, then you become a parent. So parenthood is what would be considered a phase sortal. Whereas having a rational nature would be a substance sortal. And so some philosophers would argue that personhood is just a phase sortal. It's something that comes and goes based on whatever properties you as a person are able to perform. Whereas the pro-life view would be that personhood is a substance sortal. It's what makes you a person is the kind of thing that you are. It's not any sort of the functions that you can perform. So that's the main difference between the pro-life view and the abortion choice view of personhood. And so personal identity is a different concept because you can be identical to yourself through time, but not necessarily a person at every point in your life. So what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to talk about personhood for the majority of this video, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about personal identity. So I'm going to start off by talking about some of the performance views of personhood. That there are certain philosophers who would argue that you're only a person based on the kind of functions that you can perform. And so we can call these performance views of personhood because your personhood is based on your performance of these properties. So one of the probably most common view of personhood from abortion choice philosophers and from someone you might meet on a college campus is the concept of self-awareness. That they talk about how you're not a person until you're self-aware, and the reason for that is because in order to be harmed, you have to be able to see yourself as existing through time. You have to know that you exist now, and you have to know that you exist in the future, because in order to be harmed by being deprived of your life, it has to be something that you want. And the only way that you would want to continue living is if you see yourself as existing through time. If you don't see yourself as existing through time, then continuing living is not something that you would particularly desire, and so it would not be something that you would be harmed by being deprived of. Now, the problem with most of these, what we might call performance views of personhood, is that they either prove too much. By that we mean that it makes the if we imagine this kind of a circle of personhood, everything that's within the circle, like a Venn diagram or something, everything that's within the circle of personhood would be much stricter than we want to allow, because if we're going to some of these particular views are going to exclude certain types of persons that we would want to place inside the circle. It might exclude infants, or it might exclude comatose people, or it might exclude the elderly, etc. So it proves too much by excluding certain types of people that we would want to include in the set of persons. Or these functionalist views would prove too little, and they would include things in the circle of personhood that we don't want to include, because it would include certain things like dogs and cats, um, you know, less, the less cute life forms, like some of them would include cockroaches and spiders, and for those of you who are arachnophobic like me, a view of personhood that would include spiders as intrinsically valuable is just not a view that we can hold. So, sorry about that, if you happen to be a spider lover. But basically, what that means is if you're going to include some of these animals in that circle of personhood, then that doesn't just mean that, oh, they're really cute, they make good pets, they're animals that you want to keep around, but it means that they are as valuable as human beings, meaning that if you happen to kill one of these animals, then the punishment for killing the animal should be the same as the punishment for killing a human being. So, if you, for example, if you consider cows to be persons, then killing a cow and eating its hamburgers would be something that's not just highly immoral, but it's something that we should lock you away for life, because that's how we would treat someone who kills a human being in cold blood. Or in some states, we would give you the death penalty. Or if you accidentally kill an animal, say if your view includes bunny rabbits and you happen to run over a rabbit on the road, you would be guilty of manslaughter, and we should lock you up in prison for the amount of time that we would lock someone up for accidentally killing a human being. So the main issue with these is that they either prove too much or they prove too little. But there are other problems with these as well. So going back to our example of self-awareness, in order to, a philosopher like Peter Singer or Michael Tooley might argue that in order for you to have value as a human being, you have to be able to see yourself as existing through time. Now, not only does this prove too much, because now we're excluding certain types of humans that we should include in the set of persons, like we're excluding infants, because infants are not self-aware. You don't become self-aware until sometime after your first birthday. You're also excluding other types of people, like the people in reversible comas, or people who go under general anesthesia before a surgery. And so this is not something that we want to, that this is not a position we want to hold, because we don't want to hold a position that your personhood comes and goes whenever you cease being able to perform these functions. So this has what Chris Kaiser would call the episodic problem. Now, philosophers do have a response to this view, and I'll come back to that as soon as I finish talking about the rest of these. So that's self-awareness. Another view is consciousness. Like, you have to have some kind of basic awareness of the world around you. But again, not only does that lead to the episodic problem again, because you cease being conscious every night when you fall asleep, especially when you're in a deep sleep. You're not even aware in the sense of dreaming, but you're completely not aware. You fall asleep, and you basically, it feels like no time at all has passed when you wake up, because you lose consciousness. So consciousness is another view that leads to the episodic problem. And it's also a view that proves too much, because it excludes certain types of people from the set of persons that we would want to include. So self-awareness is not a good view. Consciousness is not a good view. Some philosophers argue that it's sentience, which is what grounds our value as persons. And now, some philosophers like Wayne Sumner, who argue from sentience, don't necessarily argue that it's a personhood view, because he would say, we don't necessarily have to consider other types of animals that have sentience persons, just because they're sentient. Because what matters for someone like Sumner is not necessarily whether or not you're a person, but whether or not you can suffer. If you're the kind of being that can suffer, then you're the kind of being that we shouldn't be killing, we shouldn't be torturing, that kind of thing. So now I think there's some truth to this view, in that even though I don't consider animals like dogs and cats and pigs and cows and other kinds of animals to be persons, I think the fact that they can suffer should weigh on us a little bit, and it means that we should not, at the very least, it means we should not torture animals who are sentient. And by the way, sentience is a term that tends to be misused in this debate. Sentience is often equated with things like self-awareness and consciousness. That's not what sentience actually is. Sentience is basically just the capacity to feel, specifically the capacity to feel pain. So saying that we're sentient means that we're able to experience pain and other emotions and things like that. Now, the problem with sentience is, again, if you're going to base personhood on it, then it proves too little, and it includes certain things in the set of persons that you wouldn't want to include. But even if you're not talking about it in terms of personhood, then we see that it is still not a good view to ground one's value, because if we're going to talk about human beings, then there are some humans who are born with a congenital inability to feel pain. Um, Gabby Gingras is a famous example of this. He was born without the ability to feel pain. So if we're going to ground human value in sentience, then that means that anyone could kill someone like Gabby Gingras for any reason. Or you could kill anybody if you could do it painlessly. So if you kill someone in their sleep, if you smother them with a pillow, or if you cause them to ingest poison that can kill them painlessly, then that would be permissible if we're going to ground human value in sentience. So sentience, again, is not a good way to ground one's value as a person. Finally, one of the other major views regarding human value is a desires view of human person or human value, and that's simply that similar to self-awareness. In order to be harmed, in order to be harmed by being deprived of something, you have to desire that thing. If I have a brand new car and you steal the car, the reason that it's wrong for you to steal that car is because I desire that car, and the car is not yours to drive away with. I desire it, and so I'm being harmed by being deprived of it. Now, of course, this kind of view is open to counterexamples, because obviously it's just not the case that what accounts for my being harmed by being deprived of something is that I desire it. If I didn't desire, if we're not talking about a brand new Ferrari or Prius or insert your favorite type of car here, if we're not talking about that car, but we're talking about, say, a junker, and I don't desire to have the junker anymore, it's still not your right to drive away with it or to tow it away or anything like that. It's still my property. I have the right to determine what is done with it, even if it's not something that I desire anymore. But other philosophers, like Don Marquis, would respond to this desires account that we can conceive of certain types of people that can't desire something, and so they're being harmed by being deprived of their life if we kill them. Number one is an adult in a coma. An adult in a coma cannot desire to live because they're in a coma. They're not conscious, they're not self-aware. So it would be permissible to kill them because they can't desire to continue living. Another would be a suicidal teenager. Say a 16-year-old boy, this girl he was really into dumps him, and now he's just really distraught and he wants to kill himself because he's in such pain over losing his girlfriend. Since he no longer desires to live, we would then be permitted in killing this teenager who wants to die. But of course, just about everyone would say, well, no, we shouldn't kill this teenager because he's just going through a temporary emotional trauma. We shouldn't kill him over it. But if desires is what grounds our right to life, then it doesn't matter whether or not it's just temporary or not. If he no longer desires to live, we would then be permitted to kill him. Now, David Boonin has a response to these kinds of arguments as well. He says that these kinds of arguments succeed if we fail to make certain distinctions between types of desires. And a current desire is a desire that you are consciously entertaining. If this discussion of personhood is boring you right now and you're kind of desiring to turn it off and stop listening to me, that would be an occurrent desire. A dispositional desire is a desire that you have even if you're not consciously entertaining it. I don't think, before I began this discussion of desires, I don't think you were consciously entertaining a desire to continue living until tomorrow night. But you still had that desire dispositionally because it was still a desire you had even if you were not consciously entertaining it. So the comatose adult case, Boonin would say, doesn't succeed because we can then say that it's not that even though the person in the coma lacks the occurrent desire to continue living, his dispositional desire, his desire to continue living, even though he's not consciously entertaining it, is the desire that grounds his right to go on living. And so Boonin makes another distinction between actual and ideal desires. An actual desire is a desire that you have now, even if it's formed under less than ideal circumstances. So, for example, if you're thirsty, you might have a desire to drink something. That would be an actual desire because you're thirsty. Now, your ideal desire would be a desire that you would have given all of the proper information. So, for example, if you're thirsty and you want to drink this glass of water or this glass of tea, which, by the way, it's not Earl Grey, even though I'm a huge Trekkie. It's actually English breakfast tea, but still good tea. But if I was thirsty and I wanted to drink this tea, I can quench my thirst. But let's say that the tea that I'm drinking has been laced with poison. Well, if I don't know it's laced with poison, my actual desire will still be to drink the tea because I want to quench my thirst. But my ideal desire would be not to drink the tea because if I had all the information, if I knew that my tea was laced with poison, then I would not want to drink it because we can say that my actual desire, which is probably dispositional, one I'm not consciously entertaining, it's even though it's dispositional, not occurrent. My actual desire not to be killed strongly outweighs my my ideal desire not to be killed strongly outweighs my actual desire, even if it's occurrent and not dispositional, to quench my thirst. Now, the problem now Boonin's distinctions here are brilliant. Boonin's a really smart guy. So obviously he's put a lot of thought into his abortion choice views. But the thing is though that his view is that you don't actually become a person until you're able to start forming desires in your minds, and he calls it. Cortical brain activity is going on in your brain. That's the point at which you can form desires. And so we can say then that now you have these desires. Even if you're not consciously entertaining it, you still have a desire to live. And so that's why he would say late-term fetuses, most people have this instinct that we should not allow late-term abortions. And so he says it's because of the cortical brain activity we're able to form ideal desires even if they're not actual. But the problem with Boonin's argument, though, is that he doesn't actually argue for why cortical brain activity is necessary to have ideal desires. Because after all, it seems like we can attribute ideal desires to the embryo from fertilization. Because even if there's no consciousness going on yet in the embryo or fetus, they clearly have natural instincts. For example, one of the reasons that they're considered living things by scientists is because they're able to react to stimuli. They can react to stimuli that's in their environment. So they clearly have a natural biological desire to continue living in the same way that my dog has a desire to continue living, even if he's not self-aware in the same sense that we are, not rational. He doesn't have a conscious desire to continue living. He has an instinctual desire. So there's absolutely no reason why we have to wait for cortical brain activity to begin in the unborn. Why is it that we can't attribute ideal desires to embryos when they clearly have an instinctual desire to continue living, even if it's not a conscious one? And so I think Boonin's case falls apart because it fails to take into account the fact that, number one, embryos from fertilization have these natural instinctual desires, and number two, he fails to take into account hylomorphic views, like natural law positions on the human person, in that even though they don't have cortical brain activity presently being exercised, they have the inherent capacity for cortical brain activity, and it's that inherent capacity that grounds that flows from our human nature. And so we're valuable because we're humans, not because we're able to form desires. And so I think that's really where Boonin's view falls apart, as brilliant as Boonin is. So it's clear then that desires does not do the work of grounding our value as human persons. And so one last philosopher to talk about, Marianne Warren wrote an essay called On the Moral and Legal Status of Abortion, I believe in the 1980s. And she says that there's basically 5 criteria that we look for in persons. Number 1 is consciousness, especially the capacity to feel pain. Number 2 is reasoning, which is the developed capacity to solve complex problems. Number 3 is self-motivated activity. Number 4 is the capacity to communicate in whatever form. And number 5 is the presence of self-concepts and self-awareness. Now, she would say that not all persons would have to exhibit all 5 of these properties, but a person should at least encompass 1 or 2 of them. If a person does not encompass any of these 5, then it's clearly not a person. But the problem is that Warren doesn't even justify her view. The only justification she gives for it is that if you disagree, you really have no idea what a person even is. And I'm not exaggerating about that. You can go back and read her essay for yourself. And so, of course, Warren, again, just like all the other philosophers, failed to take into account the fact that it's our inherent capacities. So we could say, yeah, I think persons do exhibit these properties, but the thing is that the unborn from fertilization are persons because they have these capacities inherently. They're not potential persons, they're actual persons with the potential to perform these functions. So that's where Warren's argument really falls apart. Now, there are some abortion choice philosophers like Michael Tooley and even Wayne Sumner who attempt to engage with natural law arguments regarding or hylomorphic arguments regarding inherent capacities and that kind of thing. But as I've argued elsewhere, and I'll probably address sometime in these videos, their arguments just don't adequately respond to these ideas. So the main reason that these ideas fail, these properties fail, is because it fails to take into account that persons are persons based on the kind of thing that they are, things with a rational nature, rather than the kinds of things that you can do. Because if you're going to say that your personhood depends on what you can do, that's putting the cart before the horse. In the same way you have to exist as a human being to be able to develop human properties, you have to exist as a person in order to develop personal properties. These properties like self-awareness, consciousness, etc., they don't exist in a vacuum. They develop as the human being develops. So the only reason that the embryo is not self-aware, conscious, sentient, etc., is simply because it's too young to be. And so this is just a real basic response to these ideas. In my next video, I'll talk about some of these psychological accounts of personal identity. I'll talk a little bit about why these philosophers think that these various properties are what grounds our identity. So yeah, I hope you found this video informational. I hope it helps. If there's something that I still didn't quite make accessible enough, feel free to ask me questions in the comments. If there's something you'd like me to talk about in the future, please feel free to offer suggestions. So again, I'm Clinton Wilcox, a staff apologist with Life Training Institute, and I'll see you next week.